Welcome to this video, and if you haven't watched the last video in this series and you want to start with FastAPI and just get started, I recommend you watch the last video. Now, just some prerequisites again. Just assume that you have some knowledge or know Python and some knowledge about web development, or just a little bit, and maybe some knowledge about asynchronous programming. But enough talking, and let's begin. So before we start with any FastAPI, I just want to mention something called typing. So newer versions of Python now contain type annotations. This is pretty useful because it basically helps us tell what type something is. We see this in a lot of other languages where it's required to do so, but this just tells what the type actually is. So I'm just going to show you an example of such. Basically, if we import typing, we can basically define what type each one thing is. But just remember that these are not currently enforced. So int1, we can basically define, technically we could say, if this is not enforced, we can technically say this. In technicality, but for right now, we are not going to do that. Basically, yeah, we can just define types. We can just do this in a function. And then make it an int. Turn that int. So yeah, basically that's basically what typing basically is. Now I have here, and I already imported from typing, import and optional. This will be used for later. So basically, we were running our existing code, which was hello world. And now today we'll learn about one of the most fundamental features of FastAPI, which is the automatic API documentation, which uses OpenAPI, so that's Swag UI and Redoc. So in order to see this, you have to go to your link wherever. I'm on localhost 8000 or 127 here 8000. Basically, this is basically the Swag UI. They're both based on the OpenAPI. Basically, originally this is basically what it would look like. Basically, what response we're taking our schemas. Now, at first glance, this is not the most human-friendly thing, but if you actually look into it, it's not like really hard to read. But this is if there were so many things, it'll be really hard to just read it all. So basically, what these automatically documentation do is they basically make it a little bit more friendlier, to which we can like read things with different URLs. The HTTP methods are used. We can even test our code in the Swag UI. So we can even test out hello world. So when you execute, we see hello world. We see what request URL is there. And we can see the successful response. Another one we can use is Redoc. So this one. So it's /Redoc. These are all default. They all come with the FastAPI. This is the alternative. Basically, Swag UI converts the OpenAPI schema into more friendly format again. But the only thing with Redoc is that it's read only. You can only see the documentation, but you can't actually test it. This is why we use Swag UI or doc. Basically, yeah, you can use this as an alternative just to look. You can see that hello world here, successful response. You can just see the response schema. So that is another alternative documentation you can use. But in this tutorial series, we'll be usually using this documentation to test out and like look at our code. So now let us go back to our main.py. So basically in our main.py, back into our code editor, We have our simple lines of code. Now we're going to work with path parameters, our parameters. These are what we declare in our path, our URL. So basically, we're going to make a new URL. So this is app.get. Basically, we can do a component, the URL of component. But now this is where we put a parameter in. Now we don't just put a parameter or anything, because if you just put a random like parameter like here, it's gonna read it like a URL. It's not gonna accept anything. This is why we put it in these curly braces. So we can just say component ID. Now we can make our simple function. So async def and then component, or we can do get component. And then basically what we're doing here is when we type in a URL and put an argument, basically we can do this with any word or character is automatically a string. Because basically when it returns the argument, we're defining a parameter in the function, which is actually being passed with a path. So we need to define a parameter. And this is the same thing, component ID. Now we're just going to keep it as normal right now. And then we can just return in the dictionary, so which will be converted to JSON. So component ID, and that is basically, and then this is where it's going to show component ID. Your argument is going to go. We save this and run, and let's go to the URL. Now if we just test out component, it's not going to work because it requires an argument. Automatically requires an argument, so you have to put any argument. So we can just put FastAPI. That works. You can put anything in here. You can put, let's see, true. These are all converted into strings. So yeah, you can almost put anything inside here. You can also explore a bit more. We can accept types. We have to define the types in the parameter here. Basically, we have to put our argument inside the URL. That's the basics of path parameters. You can put int. It would only accept an integer, so like 1. And we can even do this in the docs. So if we just go to a different link, let me just go to docs. We go component ID, which showed. You can see that it's an integer, and we can even see it's defined as a path. We're adding it to our path. When we add something like maybe just a regular word, so like string, it's wrong because it's a character. When you can accept numbers, when you execute, you can see what it does here, and it's a successful response. This is how useful it is. We can also use bool as a type, but we'll move on from here. Our next part of our video is about query parameters. So query parameters are another part of FastAPI, very fundamental feature. So query parameters, we're going to do that. Basically, query parameters in just basic words is that it's not a parameter defined in the path, but in the function itself. So at app.get component, and then basically we can do async, and then we def read component. So I'm just going to do this as, I'm going to comment this as a path parameter, and this as a query parameter. So we can just def read, and then component, and then we can just put something like a number, which is an integer, and a text, which is a string. Okay, that's our query parameter. A query parameter, so we're going to put it here, is basically not defined in the path, but in here. And we can just basically return a number, and then the text. So basically, doing this will return it. But now we have to, we can't just put randomly an argument because it's not in the path anymore. It's why we call it a query parameter is because it automatically reads as a query, like a question. We're asking for something. So basically, when we run, let's just go run our server UV coin. So yeah, basically when we run our server, okay. Now we have to put a special URL. A query is like a question, so we put a question. So question. Now, like kind of like a keyword argument or something, we can put number, because remember in our code we put number and text. Think of it as kind of like a variable and returning it as in a dictionary converted to JSON. So basically our number, and we have to put our number equals. So our number will equal 3. And then since we have multiple arguments, we put and. For the next argument, we can say our text is equal to, and these are automatically converted to what type we define. So we can just say, this is FastAPI. And we forgot to put our component, and see it's correct right here. Our number is 3 and our text is, this is FastAPI. So we can even explore this in the docs. So let me just go into the doc and refresh this. We can see our component, and you can see here, we can also try it out here. We can put number 1. And remember, it's an int and this is a string. So when we execute, you can see here, it also makes a URL for us. You can see what it actually returns. Successful response. Okay, we can do more with this. We can even, earlier I put the optional thing. We can do that. We can make maybe our string optional. Basically, it's gonna make it optional so we don't have to be required to fill it out. Basically, we still have to combine our query parameters and just leave the equals empty, just put nothing inside. So basically, what I mean by that is like when we do something like in here, technically, okay, it still works, but if we do something like this, we leave it empty, like text and. But if we do something like this, it will give an error. We still have to basically include the text. So sorry, the text in order for this to work. Text will just be left empty. You don't have to put anything inside. Just text and equals. So just a reminder, you can also combine query and path parameters. Don't worry. It will be detected by each of its name. You can also convert bool types like true or false, but we're just going to keep moving on. So basically, that's the basics of path parameters and query parameters. Now, if that seemed like much, then you can always rewatch segments of the video. Visit the API documentation if you feel confused, but I hope you understood. Thank you for watching, and please like and subscribe.